Yo, listeners, what's up? Hope everybody had a great Easter. Some of my kids still believe in the Easter Bunny, and it's only because of my wife. I wanted to ditch the Easter Bunny and the Tooth Fairy a long time ago, but because it's her desire for them to still believe and be kids, I've submitted to my wife. I think I'm down with Santa a little bit more. I seriously think the concept of the Easter Bunny is creepy. Like as a kid, I visualized the Easter Bunny as like a man bunny on two legs standing, but it's quiet. It doesn't talk. It just passes out candy. It's kind of scary. I was thinking how vague also the Easter Bunny is. At least with Santa, there's a backstory. He lives in the North Pole with Mrs. Claus, works through the year for Christmas Eve night. He has a list that he checks twice. He gets to people's houses by sleigh. But the Easter Bunny, we know nothing about. Like even the Tooth Fairy makes more sense. It flies around to people's houses. How does the Easter Bunny get to places? It's crazy stuff, man. It's crazy stuff. Hey, we are on Instagram at PWNApod and would love to have you guys check that out. I can't stop giggling because I was thinking about just the generational baton of technology. Like Instagram, that's about it for me. I don't even like Insta stories. Like I don't want to do the stories. I've got Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. And I really feel like I need to stretch myself a little bit just to, the next 10 years maybe try to get into some other, the new stuff just so I'm not completely archaic. But it is a generational thing, man. I remember my grandpa calling my dad on the phone, literally saying, "Hey, this VCR you bought me, the damn thing doesn't work." My dad, of course, is saying, "Dad, it does work. Your VCR works. Let me try to walk you through it." "Hell no, don't walk me through it. Just come over here and fix the damn thing." And so it was like 2 miles away. My dad goes over there. He's like, "Well, Dad, you don't have the power on. You didn't push power for the VCR." So, and so my dad, he's probably stopping at cellular devices and Facebook. That's the extent of his technology. And I love how his generation and only particularly, there's a lot of them, but it's not everybody. I'm not broad brushing here, but I love how that generation carries themselves on Facebook, like genuinely love it. Like I know one guy that signs every single one of his posts and comments. He writes his name at the end of them. It's just great stuff. It's great stuff. But one thing we want to do on Instagram is we would love to show folks some of our listeners. And so if you'd like to be featured on our Instagram, it's in the infant stages for sure. And we think, well, we would love this. This would be fun. But you can email us at pwnacontact@gmail.com. That's pwnacontact@gmail.com. That'll be in the show notes. Thank you, guys. So Jack is one of the smartest people that I know. He's not a BSer. If he doesn't know something, he's not going to pretend that he does. And he's also, I think, pretty darn fair in how he considers both sides of an issue. So I threw some zingers his way in this conversation. Thoughts on conspiratorial thoughts on COVID-19. How doomed is our economy? And is Trump to blame for the position that we're in now? Some stuff along those lines. I enjoy hearing what he has to say, and I hope you do too. Next week, back to the spiritual stuff. I was on a podcast in which the host is an atheist, so he grilled me for about an hour. It's pretty fun. All right. Much love, everybody. All right, Jack, thanks for joining us again. How do you feel about being my go-to with questions? Like, does that make you feel uneasy? Do you think I'm a fool for that?
I'm probably not the best person to answer that, but you might want to get somebody else's perspective. But I always enjoy it because I feel like you come to me with like, hey, here's something, and I'm not sure what to think, and maybe you have some ideas. And yeah. I always enjoy thinking about the questions you ask.
That's a compliment. Your son actually says the same thing, and so I certainly appreciate it very much. And I actually, it's kind of I feel like I'm being generous to my listeners by sharing some of my friends with everybody. So crazy times that we are living in. And I'm, just some random questions that I've been thinking through, because I think that this time is such a abnormality. There's just things that don't seem to make sense because we're just not used to this. But, early on, I was thinking, okay, well, we have this threat, we have this virus, and there's all these sorts of predictions and what we may end up having to do. And even just a few days ago, everything changes so quickly, but even a few days ago, they were talking about maybe there should be mandatory mask wearing, or maybe there should be more mandatory stay-at-homes. And I'm like, why not just do all of that stuff right now? Like, if this thing has the potential of spreading and being a really major problem, then why are we just considering these things? Why don't we just go as extreme as we can right now? Like, I don't understand that.
Well, I would say that one of the things that anytime you're in a position of leadership, you have to make sure that you are not leading people faster or further than they are willing to go. And, some of the people who are saying, well, like, why didn't we, have really drastic measures 2 months ago when they thought this might be coming? And it's like, well, we didn't do that for Ebola. We didn't do it for SARS. Some of the earlier things. And, how do you marshal support for drastic measures when people don't feel a sense of urgency?
Who were the presidents, by the way, with the two that you just named, Ebola and...
SARS was 2014, I think.
Okay, so that would have been Obama.
And Ebola, I think, was 2003, which would have been
Bush.
George W. Bush.
Yeah.
And, I think regrettably, we didn't look at those as warning shots that we should have spurred us to better preparation. But that, too, is just natural,
Right.
I mean, like, one example I think of is, think about World War II. Which I think, to the extent that we look back on that in terms of history, we think of that as one of the shining moments for our country.
Right.
We were the good guys. We defeated some bad players. We were gracious in victory. We, helped them get back on their feet and become liberal democracies and et cetera, et cetera. And yet we were the last major country to enter, and Pearl Harbor had to be bombed for us to do it. Even though leadership knew a couple years ahead of time, we're going to have to do something to stop Hitler.
Yeah.
So why didn't Roosevelt do something? Because people weren't ready for that step. And what's the ramifications if people aren't ready and you pull the trigger? So let's say FDR 2 years earlier than Pearl Harbor decided to get into the war. It just makes people mad, because that seems to be worth it. Just people being mad. Well, but then do you have support, So here's one of the things that's just interesting. Like, if you look at, I would say, the larger historical context, why have democracies, again, realize there's been ebbs and flows, but why have democracies become these, arguably, in general, the most powerful forms of government? Because they marshal people behind them. So you're a king, you have an army that you're paying. If you stop paying them, they're not loyal, And your ability to marshal an army to fight the guys next door is totally dependent on how much money you have.
Yeah.
Democracies aren't like that. They tend to respond slowly to problems because it takes a while for everybody to get on the same page. But then once they do, you're not commanding people to do something that they may or may not want to do. You're directing them, and they're engaged. And so democracies end up having, bringing kind of like far more power to bear in a crisis situation, though they stumble usually at the outset.
Right.
So I just think that's part of the way that our form of government works.
Right.
It until you get everybody on board, you can command all you want, and nothing's going to happen.
Yeah. Yeah, for
and
sure.
The thing is, if you start ordering people to do something and then they don't comply and you can't compel them, well, then the next thing you order them to do, you might as well forget it. I mean, you've lost your authority.
Right.
So you got to be careful that you preserve your ability to direct people by making sure you don't direct them to do something they don't want to do.
Right. So leadership is tricky, huh? I saw an ad, and it's interesting because my kids, especially the two oldest, are getting at an age to where it's neat. It's almost like adult-ish conversations. And our family, we are not like this big Trump family. I think if anything, I do lean a little more conservative fiscally, but I'm just not really involved in thinking through politics and all of that. But we're not big Trump fans, just because you and I have talked about it, just how he is and the things that he says and all of that. But I saw an ad. My daughter and I we were watching TV, and this ad comes on, and it's basically showing just horrible pictures of people in hospitals and dead bodies being carried out. And then it literally wraps up by basically saying all of this is on Trump, and it actually says failure on the screen. And the people that put this commercial out, they're called United Us or something like that. And I saw that commercial, and it just was so off-putting because I was like, we are going through a pandemic, and unless you can say that Donald Trump wants a bunch of people to die, like that's his angle, I just want to see people die, then let's not finger point right now. Let's just keep going. And so I rarely do this, but I made a tweet about that ad, and I just said there's just something that doesn't feel right about it, but kind of welcomed some pushback. Well, one of my friends who goes by Godless, he said, "You're right. We should totally wait until all the coffins are full before calling attention to the lack of initiatives and supplies needed to reduce the number of bodies to put in the coffins and the lack of coffins." And he basically wrote out, basically January the 8th is the first CDC warning. January 9th, Trump rally. January 14th, Trump rally. January 15th, first U.S. Coronavirus case. January 18th, Trump goes golfing. January 19th, Trump goes golfing. And just basically this timeline that makes it sound like Trump just didn't care. Now, I just don't pay close enough attention to have a real opinion on that. But my guess is that it's not a conservative liberal thing. It's anybody in that position could have made, like if there's big mistakes being made, and they very well may be, it seems like anybody could make those mistakes for the very things that you were talking about. Like leadership is tricky. When do we pull the trigger? But how do you feel about people saying Trump is a failure through all this? It's his fault.
Well, I think you'd have to point to every president before him and say, preparation doesn't begin January 8th and be in place by the beginning of March. It takes years to prepare for something like this if you're going to prepare well. And the challenge is there are a million threats out there. Do you prepare for all of them? How do you know which ones to prepare for? It's funny, again, using my Pearl Harbor analogy, there were warnings that the Japanese were going to attack before December 7th, 1941. And there have been, histories published like why did Roosevelt ignore these? Why did the chiefs of staff ignore these? Why, and conspiracy theories about they wanted it to happen. They wanted people to die because, and the truth is, in my mind, there were hundreds of warnings coming from dozens of directions. That happens every day. That's what the intelligence services do. And they try to sort through those and figure out what's credible, what's not. What do we have to be ready for? What do we have to pay more attention to? It's the proverbial needle in a haystack.
Right.
And you're kind of looking back and saying, now that we know what the needle was, why didn't you find it ahead of time? It's like,
right.
It's easy to say afterwards.
Sure. How about acting soon enough, though? Like, do you think that the red flag, so to speak, of what we were seeing in China, and apparently, again, I hear bits and pieces, and I never know who to believe, but I hear that Trump was giving some firm warnings, and people are just basically saying he didn't act quick enough. Like we're in a bigger pickle because he didn't act quick enough.
Well, I think there's truth to that he could have realized more quickly the seriousness of this. I think anybody's subject to making a mistake like that. And I don't say that dismissively either. That's a hard one. But I think one of the challenges with this pandemic was it was very hard to have any sense for what was really going on in China. And then the other place where they had really a major outbreak early on was Iran, both of whom were strictly controlling information. It was hard to get an understanding of what was happening. And so I just think in the absence of reliable information, people are more prone to make misjudgments. Yeah. So again, I'm not trying to whitewash Trump. Like I said, I do think that he was dismissive past the point where he should have been. But I also don't look at that as like you said, that's not a conservative or a liberal thing. That's not a good leader versus bad leader thing. Every leader makes mistakes.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you can point to Bill Clinton and say all of 9/11 was Bill Clinton's fault because he had an opportunity to have Osama bin Laden and he didn't take the opportunity. Where, so you really think if Bill Clinton knew that was going to happen, that he would have just said, I'm playing golf? I mean, it's just like the rhetoric both sides is like, come on, man. And that's what that's really where I stand on. I'm like, unless you think someone is purposely trying to make it to where more people die, let's not,
Yeah.
It'd be good for this to be a part of the debate in September and October if a lot of this dies down. That's very relevant stuff to talk about, but not now.
Yeah. I agree. I mean, but it's interesting. I mean, I think one of the things I would say in fairness is this is the strength of our system.
Yeah.
It's ugly sometimes when it's happening, but we're allowed to stand up and complain about the lousy job our leaders are doing. And
right.
And the issue that a place like China has is they're not. And so mistakes go a lot further. And, course corrections don't get made. I was watching the news conference the other night, and somebody was asking Vice President Pence about, what about uninsured people? And he kind of gave his talking point answer, but it wasn't really, and the reporter wouldn't let it go, and they kind of finally didn't. But then the next day, they came back at their briefing and said, here's what we're doing for uninsured people. It's like, okay, they probably weren't as attuned to that as they could have been. But we're allowed to raise questions, and the thing is, leaders respond in our system for the most part.
Right. I like that observation for sure. So let's talk about money stuff and economy and things that are just so interesting to me, and things that I don't really have the background to adequately assess it. But at this point, and let's give people a timestamp because I'm not sure when this will air. So we are talking Wednesday, April the 8th, 2020. And at this point, Jack, do you feel like the timing as well as the nature of the quarantine is a good move, also considering what it's doing to the economy?
That's such a hard question. It's like
I need you to answer.
Yeah, I hear you. But I mean, it's one where genuinely there are just such unknowns. It's like, I think the damage that they're doing, I think catastrophic is not too strong a word. And the fact that
to the economy.
Yes. And the fact that it's dragging on for weeks, it's funny. I was reading a thing there that estimated that 30% of restaurants and personal care businesses will never reopen. And that doesn't seem like an outlandish estimate to me.
How many you said?
30%. Now, again, I'm not trying to argue that that's the number, but I think it's going to be huge as long as this is dragging on. And
so give me the background on that. Why can't a restaurant, especially with some of these initiatives that the government is doing as far as being able to keep people on payroll and those sorts of money stimulus, what is happening to a restaurant if when all this is over they can't start back up?
Well, so think about our city, Charleston, okay? You're one of the chain restaurants here in one of the outskirts of the town. Your rent is probably a pretty modest proportion of your total revenue. And if you can keep your people and pay your rent, you're okay. Let's say you're downtown on King Street. How much do you think your rent is? Yeah. Now,
Unreal.
The government's got this program, and they're really trying to have you keep folks employed. They're saying you can borrow this money. This is the payroll protection program, which is an interesting program. And kudos to them for getting it launched in a week. That's kind of amazing. Now, it's a bit of a mess right now, and every day they're coming out with new guidance, and understandably, it's incredibly complex what they're trying to do. But one of the things that they're saying is they'll forgive part of the loan if you use at least 75% of it for payroll. That's not exactly the way it's framed. So they will not, out of what they end up forgiving, at least 75% has to be for payroll. Well, what if your rent is half of your costs?
Yeah.
And even there, it's like it's for 8 weeks and blah, blah. It's like, what if they come in and they say, okay, you can reopen, but your dining room, which was built for 200, we're not going to let you seat more than 30 at a time. And honestly, I would just say that a lot of businesses will never make it to the point where they could even get the money.
Right.
They're moving as fast as they can to get this out, and yet I don't think it's going to be in time for a lot of people.
Right.
It's just, I mean, it's a again, and it's so unprecedented. Who would have ever thought that one of the risks that you have to have is, oh, what if they shut you down and they can't even tell you when it might be possible for you to ever reopen?
Right. Yeah.
Wow.
So do you think that how if you had to guess, how do you see this playing out from the standpoint of our economy? And yeah, I guess also that the economy is dependent on what happens to the virus, but when things rebound, when do you think we'll start being able to get out there? Okay, 30% of businesses may not be able to continue. What does that cause? What's the causality to the whole economy? Like, how do you think things are going to pan out?
You know, one of the things that if you look at two of the types of companies that have been hardest hit in the stock market drop, one of them has been what are called real estate investment trusts, which are basically, it's a way of investing in people who own apartment complexes and shopping malls and office complexes and so on. That's normally considered a very safe investment. And the value of that the value of those REITs has dropped way more than the average. Because people are saying, okay, like if none of your commercial clients are earning any revenue, can any of them pay their rent? And if you don't get rent paid, how are you going to pay the bank? And then the bank's values have plummeted because people are saying, who's going to be able to pay the bank? And, you know, when you think about how that can ripple through the economy, you know, again, you can, at this point, you'd be speculating on what the numbers are, but it's the potential for it to be like catastrophic.
Right.
And, you know, in ways that that's kind of hard to wrap your mind around because we've never really had a shutdown like this before. So the Wall Street Journal, they published a thing, I think it was yesterday, that said that their estimate is that economic activity by the end of March had dropped 29%. That's like a Great Depression drop.
20%?
29. That's way more than the Great Recession was. Way more. And it happened like in 2 weeks.
Great Recession in the 30s?
No, the Great Recession of 2008, 09.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we're in worse shape than 08, 09 right now.
In terms of the depth of the drop of activity. Yeah.
What about comparing to the 30s?
Well, again, that's so different. I mean, it's way too early to tell that yet. And the government, you know, one of the things that the Depression did, and that actually then the Great Recession did, was, you know, you have this problem, and the government says, we don't have any tools to help this. So they develop tools. Well, then they're available next time. So, you know, I had a couple of friends who were saying, like, what is all this stuff that they're talking about the Fed doing with? And it's like they're pulling out the tools that they developed during the Great Recession to keep financial institutions from failing. They're pulling them out right now so we don't go down that path, trying to make sure that there's liquidity in the system and so on. So, you know, in some ways we're better prepared for this than we were for earlier crises because of what we've learned from them.
Yeah.
But every crisis brings its new elements too that are kind of imponderable.
So how we have been responding, including the paychecks that families or the stimulus checks that people are going to be receiving, what you're seeing as far as the country's response to the potential economic crisis, are you thinking, well, they're doing a decent job trying to figure this out, you know? Or
yes, I do think that.
Yeah.
I mean, I think both from the point of view of what the Federal Reserve is doing in terms of, the policies that they've implemented, and of course they can move very quickly. And honestly, again, it's interesting. You look at how polarized our political system is, and yet Congress passed a bill that the president was able to sign within about a week. That was like the biggest economic package in the history of the planet. That's impressive, I think. And, it has stuff in there that you'd say, why is that there? But, honestly, of course, they're putting this together in a week. And they're trying to get everybody on the same page, and everybody's got different perspectives. So they make some compromises. I mean, I think on balance, you have to look at that and say it's a remarkable accomplishment.
Right. So what I don't understand about economics, particularly pertaining to America, is we have this ridiculous debt. And if I'm not mistaken, all of our money is not based in gold anymore, is it? Okay.
Right.
So if that's the case, and they're able to throw out this stimulus package, why wouldn't it matter? Like, I really don't understand the economical side of this. Why wouldn't it matter to just say, you know what? The best thing that we can do right now is pay off everybody's mortgages. Like, it seems like money doesn't matter, so just do something crazy. It's not based in gold anyway. Like, I don't get the components of this. Like, why can't you do something like that? I mean, talk about stimulating the economy, no one having mortgage payments.
Yeah, it doesn't help the renters very much.
Right.
And they're probably the more vulnerable people for the most part. So that's one reason.
The owners. So I own a house. If they paid it off, then the loaner gets their money.
Right. But if you're a renter in an apartment complex, so the owner of the apartment complex gets his loan paid off.
Gotcha.
That's good for him in the bank. It doesn't really help the renters very much.
Yeah.
I mean, so what they're trying to do is say, actually, we're going to put money in people's hands. Everybody's situation is different. You got to pay rent. You got to pay a mortgage, but both of you have the same housing need.
Right.
And we're not going to worry about which is which. So that's one reason. Second reason, though, the dollars are very different. So $2 trillion sounds like an infinite amount of money. And in one sense, it kind of is. But, okay, so you've got an economy that generates roughly 20 trillion plus something a year. So it's 10% of our annual economic output. They're kind of saying we're going to lose a quarter's worth of maybe 30% of a quarter's worth. Quarter's worth is 5 trillion. 30% is $1.5 trillion. 2 trillion, you're trying to use that to close the gap. So it kind of makes sense. I think people also look at it and say, well, if 2 trillion, why not borrow 20 trillion?
Right. Give everybody $10,000.
So actually, again, there are limits to affordability. I think so. If you look at the country's balance sheet, if you look at your household, you'd say you got money in the bank. You've got a house, which is an asset, minus whatever you owe on that house. You've probably got some equity in it. So on balance, if we looked at everything that you owned and subtracted what you owe on it, there'd be money left over. And that's true with the United States of America, too. And so you got to make sure you're not borrowing to the point where you're borrowing more than your assets can eventually pay back.
Yeah.
So one way to look at that 2 trillion is that the market value of all of the stocks in the S&P 500, the 500 biggest companies in the United States, their combined value is about 20 trillion. So you're borrowing 10% of that. That's huge. Now, in one sense, you'd say, I can't remember the last estimate that I saw of total, the total value of America, all of American assets, and that's a tricky one anyway, but it's probably in the 70 trillion range.
Yeah.
So you're borrowing 3% of that. Now, we're going to be meaningfully poorer on the other side of this, but we kind of have to do that. We just acknowledge that's where we are to get through it. But if you borrowed 20 trillion, you're reaching the point where who's going to buy those treasury notes that you claim you're going to be able to pay back?
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes sense. So what do you think? Do you think we rebound from this? I mean, if you had to guess, are we going to go into a 1930s extent of failure in our economy? I mean, is it going
to... nobody knows is the truthful answer, because it's based on decisions that haven't been made yet. And nobody, including the people who are going to make them, know what those decisions will be yet. So, I mean, I think people who are expecting a quick rebound, I don't expect that. I also don't expect a 10-year-long depression. I think it's going to be a very severe recession because when we get back to normal, it won't be normal. It won't be, oh, everything's back to the way it was. No, there will still be restrictions. And like, when's the next time you're going to have a professional sports event with 60,000 people in the stands? I don't know. I don't think that's going to be May. Again, I could be totally wrong on that, but that's just my sense is that they'll start, opening up things more gradually than that. So the impact will be lingering. And so I think there's going to be, and I think what'll happen, again, if anywhere close to 30% of restaurants and retail establishments don't reopen, that's going to have a catastrophic impact on the property markets, on the banks, which is going to ripple through everything else.
Yeah.
So, and see, I think, part of what's going to happen with this is life on the other side will be different, even when everything is reopened, because we're going to have different patterns. That means that some people who had good businesses aren't going to have them anymore. That means that some trends that were in motion will be accelerated, like what percentage of goods are bought online versus in a store.
Right.
Lots of stores, I think, are going to close. I just think that trend is really going to be accelerated. I think there will be other innovations that come out of this there will be winners and losers.
Yeah.
And as that all plays out, you're going to have a lot of destruction of economic value and, new things that are better and healthier built out of that. But that process of transition will take time and it'll be painful.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think about the church, and I mean specifically like church structures and church organizations, and the system, not necessarily the body of Christ, and how that will change. And there's part of me that sees church almost exploding when things are back to normal, just because people are like, oh my gosh, we need community. I think statistically people attend church 1 to 2 times a month. I could see people really increasing that and everything. But I can also see folks seeing all of the innovation that churches have been needing to put forth and prefer that, prefer online stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and it'll probably be some confusing mix of both of those two things.
Yeah.
I do think that the spiritual interest, it always increases during times of crisis. And, it's funny. I just think that part of this whole pandemic thing with Americans is most of us live lives where we kind of lose sight of the fact that there are these big, powerful forces out there that we have no control over. And it's funny. I'm in a business, as you know, I'm in a marine transportation business, and we deal with that all the time. We're sending small ships out into the big ocean, right. and bad things can happen. We were talking a little earlier about this ship carrying 4,000 cars that hit something, rolled on its side in the harbor in one of the ports in Georgia, and now what do you do with it? They're going to have to scrap it. It's in 100 feet of water. The tides are there. Hurricane season's coming. It's like it's easy to go on a project like that and just realize we are so small and this problem is so big. Right. And, it's one of the things that kind of helps me keep a perspective of there are things that are much bigger than I am in this world. But most of us, we live these lives where we're kind of insulated from those bigger things. And we kind of lose sight of the fact that they can still happen to us.
Yeah. 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 It's definitely challenging to us spoiled Americans for sure. For sure. So, one thing that I thought of, or maybe I heard someone else say, and I thought was noteworthy, why wouldn't it be better to have somewhat of a response, a compromising response, in that we tell people 60 and above, 70 and above, but let's just say 60 and above, or any age with pre-existing health conditions that would not be a good mix with this virus. You guys stay home, and then everyone 59 and younger without those pre-existing health conditions, keep our economy going. Stay with your jobs. Because everything I hear is if Joey Svendsen gets this coronavirus, I need to rest for a few days and I'll be okay.
Yeah.
Sounds like the same thing for my kids. So why wouldn't we have a huge sect of our population carry our economy? Why?
Yeah. Well, two things. First of all, I mean, I've asked this. I mean, I wonder the same thing. I mean, I think that's the logical question, right? If the truly vulnerable people are a small subset, why not just focus on keeping them out of harm's way and letting everybody else go around their business? And I guess part of what I would say is I'm not getting the briefings every day.
Yeah.
So I'm sure that the epidemiologists have answers to that I'm just not aware of. And I'm not saying that like blindly trusting them. I'm just saying I realize I don't have full information. But to me, I would just tell you how I interpret this whole thing is this whole lockdown thing is not to keep people from getting the disease. It's to keep too many people from getting it too quickly before we have a good supply of the medical equipment needed to care for patients. So you don't have people like dying in the hallways of hospitals like you've had in Italy, right? And so you do that for a time because ultimately everybody's going to get it.
Yeah,
that's kind of what they're saying.
Right.
So flattening the curve doesn't mean shortening the curve. They're just trying to make sure it doesn't happen too quickly until they're more prepared for it.
Right. Yeah. Well, some people would look at these moves that we've made and ask the same questions about whether it's worth completely demolishing our economy in order to do all this stuff. And there's a lot of conspiratory thinking. As far as conspiratists think, there's a lot that really do believe, and they feel they almost have evidence for higher powers like humans that basically their aim is a one world government, one world economy, and that this could possibly be a conspiracy to take some steps forward with that. And I don't know what I think about conspiracy. Like I don't really see how the story that we've gotten about JFK, for instance, can really be true. Like one dude, and that seems impossible. Reading the stuff that I've read, seeing the stuff that I've seen, and I think the majority of Americans would agree. Yeah, something's fishy with that. But there's people that believe we've never landed on the moon. 9/11 was done internally. Sandy Hook mass shooting in the kindergarten classroom didn't really happen. I mean, there's just flat earthers and all of that sort of thing. But I guess I'm curious what you think about conspiracies in general, and then what would you say to someone that says we're not really getting the truth? Like I sent to you, and obviously it's an example of this sort of stuff, and you really can't trust what you see on the internet. But just for a frame of reference, supposedly there is a picture of a hospital room that was released on the news in Italy a few weeks ago, and then they released a picture of a hospital room in America 3 weeks later, and they were the exact same pictures.
Yes.
Well,
so how does that? Is that a conspiracy? I guess conceivably. And what I'd say, paranoids have real enemies. It's not just because you're paranoid doesn't mean that there isn't something there. I would just say a lot of this stuff, you don't need to have a conspiracy theory to account for how it would happen. It seems simpler to just say somebody was in a hurry. They were trying to show a picture and it was like, we got one. Yeah. Well, it's not really New York, but it doesn't matter. It's a hospital. We're just trying to show a picture that will help people visualize. So it's okay. I mean, that's my guess as to the more likely way it happened. Because again, they're scrambling, trying to put information together to present, at a certain time every night.
Yeah.
I don't think that's to me, that's not conspiracy theory stuff. That's just somebody making a very bad judgment,
Yeah.
And see, here's the thing that I would say, Joey, is, and it was quickly discovered that was what had happened, and it was shown to the world, and the station that did it, the network that did it was humiliated. They wouldn't willingly have done something that dumb, is my view, because they would have known that it's likely to come out. And that's what I think about the conspiracy theory thing.
So that did happen? Those pictures?
Oh, it did happen.
Okay.
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah. And that's what I think about conspiracy theory stuff is we've got a system where, you're going to have somebody in the inside saying, wait a minute, I can be a hero if I raise my hand here. I can maybe get millions if I could get to the right person and tell my story. There are all kinds of motivations in addition to the honorable ones for people blowing the whistle on stuff like that. And we are a society full of whistleblowers. I think people don't realize how hard a conspiracy theory like that would be to actually pull off.
Right. Even something like JFK, where it seems like there was a very orchestrated, strategic plan to where no one that has a different narrative is even going to be paid attention to or listened to. And I don't know, because I agree with you. It seems like one person who works in media would take advantage of blowing up a story, but if the majority of people working in media are going along with the information that they're given, then the people that are willing to speak out can be ridiculed and scoffed at.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. There are a lot of people who really believe that what the Warren Commission reported about JFK's assassination was full of holes. And which I would say two things. One is I've read the Warren Commission report. Say if you read it, you might find it more convincing.
Yeah.
If you've only read the other side, then it's natural for that to be very convincing. I'm not saying that I think the Warren Commission report is completely, part of what they were trying to do was bring closure on something quickly. So they were trying to get through this expeditiously. They, drew some conclusions, you could argue, before they had all the facts in. Of course. You always if you wait for all the facts to come in, you will never get it done, which is why people are still writing histories of ancient Rome and drawing new conclusions 2,000 years later.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just the way life is.
Right.
And, I think they had again, unlike you, I was alive and sentient during that time. I'm an old guy. So there was a tremendous drive to just put it to bed. Not because I think there was a conspiracy to hide something, but because it was a different time. And you had guys say, this is what's better for the country is to move on and not let this be a thing that just sucks all the oxygen out of the room for the next 5 years.
Yeah.
And again, right or wrong. I'm not trying to argue it was right.
Yep. Always fun, man. Thanks for your thoughts.
It is always fun. I appreciate the opportunity, Joey.
All right,
Thank
thanks,
you.
Jack.